2:58 a.m., Minneapolis. The city looked intact from above, street grids glowing evenly, traffic lights cycling for no one, snow packed hard along the curbs like it had been there forever. But beneath the surface, something was already moving. The first breach didn't come with sirens. It came with silence. Unmarked vehicles rolled into position along municipal service lanes that most people didn't know existed. No headlights, no radio chatter, just doors opening and closing with practiced restraint. FBI and ICE teams moved together, deliberately mixed so no single unit carried the full picture. This wasn't a show of force, it was a containment maneuver. The target was not a drug house, not a warehouse, not a border crossing. It was city infrastructure. 2 blocks from City Hall, behind a row of municipal garages marked Facilities Maintenance, thermal imaging flagged a void where no void should be. A long, linear absence beneath reinforced concrete. Not random, engineered, the kind of space that takes permits, inspections, and someone willing to sign off without asking questions. At 3:04, the first door was opened. It looked ordinary, beige paint, standard handle. The kind of door thousands of city employees walk past every day without noticing. It wasn't forced. It was unlocked with credentials that were still valid. The air on the other side didn't smell like a basement. It smelled processed, filtered, cold. A ramp dropped away at a shallow angle, wide enough for carts, lit with industrial LEDs, spaced too evenly to be improvised. Ventilation hummed behind the walls, fresh, maintained. Someone had been here recently. By 3:07, the teams were underground. The tunnel didn't feel like concealment. It felt like infrastructure. Painted lane markers, drainage channels, directional stencils on the walls, coded, subtle. This wasn't built to hide. It was built to move things efficiently, out of sight, without friction. Halfway down the corridor, a junction split left and right. The left branch ran toward a closed municipal parking structure. The right bent toward a block zoned for redevelopment. One of the mayor's flagship projects. Millions approved, deadlines extended, oversight deferred. At 3:12, they reached the first node. A reinforced chamber opened into a logistics space that explained everything without saying a word. Pallet racks, sealed containers, rolling carts tagged with dates and destinations. No logos, no branding, just numbers, weights, timetables. On one wall, a digital board still active, cycling through routes mapped across the city and beyond. Each route paired with a time window measured in minutes, not hours. This wasn't storage, it was scheduling. Agents documented quickly, methodically. Every detail mattered. This wasn't about contraband yet. It was about scale, about repetition, about how often something had moved through here without interruption. Then they found the access ladder. It rose vertically into darkness, terminating beneath a municipal office complex adjacent to the mayor's administrative wing. The ladder wasn't hidden. It was integrated, designed to be used by people who belong there. At 3:19, a second team entered the mayor's office suite from above. No forced entry, no alarms. The building recognized them as authorized. That was the first moment anyone said it out loud. This was allowed. In a secured room behind the office, filed as archival storage, sat another door, another scanner, another quiet confirmation tone. Inside, a small data center hummed. Local servers, redundant power, no external markings, no indication it existed on any municipal inventory. One screen was still live. It showed a financial dashboard, not personal accounts, not slush funds, municipal flows, development grants, infrastructure budgets, service contracts, line items that looked boring enough to survive audits. The totals rolled steadily upward. 410 milioni dollari. Not stolen, routed, every transfer approved, every delay justified, every exception documented, clean enough to pass, invisible enough to scale. At 3:26, command was notified. This wasn't a raid on a mayor. It was the discovery of a system that had been running underneath him, or through him, for years. And if Minneapolis had tunnels like this, the question wasn't who else was involved. It was how many other cities had already been built the same way. By 4:41 a.m., the servers were in transit, not hauled out like trophies, but sealed, tagged, and escorted, as if they were evidence of something fragile, because they were. This phase wasn't about what had been found underground. It was about proving it existed everywhere else. The cyberbay came online before dawn. Lights dimmed, screens woke in sequence. The room filled with the low, even hum of machines doing exactly what they were designed to do. Analysts didn't rush. They didn't need to. The architecture they were looking at had a rhythm. Once you found it, the rest followed. By 5:02, the first images were complete. By 5:14, integrity checks aligned. By 5:27, the room went quiet. Not because anything failed, but because nothing resisted. No encryption theatrics, no panic deletions. Just folders named after projects that sounded civic, redevelopment, mobility, public safety integration. Vendor directories that matched procurement language down to the punctuation. Each dataset wore a different face, different logos, different mission statements. But underneath, the structures were identical. Same directory trees, same timestamp cadence, same metadata fingerprints. Whoever built this didn't improvise. They cloned. A city map assembled itself on the wall, not a street map, a flow map. Nodes appeared at municipal garages, redevelopment zones, nonprofit offices, private parking structures. Lines connected them in patterns that mirrored traffic studies and zoning plans, because that's where scrutiny thinned. Where inspectors were overworked, where delays were normal, then the financial layer resolved. Funds moved cleanly, grants approved, change orders justified, contracts extended, money entered as public good and exited as service costs. No shell company sloppiness, no offshore theatrics, just domestic vendors with boring names and perfect paperwork. The innovation wasn't laundering dirty cash, it was turning legitimacy into fuel. At 6:11, an analyst flagged a pattern in the approvals. The same authority surfaced again and again, sometimes directly, sometimes via delegated sign-off. Waivers granted, inspections postponed. Temporary exceptions made permanent by time. There were no suspicious deposits tied to it, no kickbacks, no pressure calls. This wasn't bribery, this was authorship. By 6:39, the tunnels made sense. They weren't criminal conveniences. They were logistics infrastructure designed to exploit the city's own blind spots. Maintenance windows, utility easements, construction phases that stretched just long enough to hide movement beneath them. Every route aligned with paperwork that already existed. At 7:04, a second map overlaid the first. Regional connections lit up. Rail spurs, interstate access points, facilities just outside routine enforcement patterns. Minneapolis wasn't the center. It was a hub, a clean one, efficient, reliable. The number appeared again, not as a headline, but as a cumulative result. $420 million, spread across years, across programs, across vendors that delivered exactly what their invoices described, just not what the city thought it was paying for. At 7:22, command made the call. This couldn't be dismantled in pieces. Any staggered move would trigger rerouting. The system had been built to adapt, to shed compromised components and keep breathing. The decision wasn't to arrest, it was to amputate. Phase 2 would be simultaneous. Across the floor, warrants queued, financial freezes lined up, air assets reassigned. Border partners alerted. This wasn't escalation, it was synchronization. The network had learned how government moved, slowly, sequentially, predictably. Now, it was about to encounter something it hadn't modeled. Movement everywhere, at once, without warning. By 8:13, field teams began repositioning in silence. The tunnels beneath Minneapolis were no longer just evidence. They were a template. And if the template worked here, it worked elsewhere. By the time the city woke up, the question wasn't whether the mayor was involved. It was how many layers above and below him had been built to make involvement unnecessary. Phase 2 began before most of the Midwest finished waking up. There was no announcement, no visible surge, just a quiet shift in posture across dozens of cities at once. Vehicles already in position adjusted by blocks, not miles. Teams that had looked idle minutes earlier moved with purpose. This wasn't a hunt. It was a synchronized shutdown. At 9:02 a.m., the first warrants cleared in batches. Not one address, not one office. Entire categories. Municipal contractors, redevelopment partners, transportation vendors, nonprofits that existed almost entirely on paper, but moved real volume through real space. The goal wasn't to seize everything. It was to watch what moved when pressure appeared. The network responded immediately. Routes adjusted by minutes, not hours. Trucks left early. Vans skipped scheduled stops and rerouted to secondary locations that had passed inspections last quarter. Inventory shifted from one safe address to another that looked just as boring on a map. This was the window analysts had been waiting for. Movement, not paperwork, betrayed the system. Interdictions followed behavior. In St. Paul, a service warehouse listed as electrical maintenance opened onto a transfer floor still warm from use. Tire marks hadn't cooled. Clipboards lay abandoned mid-task. A whiteboard listed times in columns. Handoffs, not deliveries. No destinations, no names, just intervals. In Duluth, a parking structure closed for structural review concealed a freight elevator that descended below the lowest listed level. The space beneath wasn't storage, it was staging, carts tagged by weight, schedules taped to concrete walls, everything aligned to windows measured in minutes. In Rochester, a non-profit office cleared staff in under 2 minutes once the first freeze notices propagated. The front was clean, the basement wasn't. Investigators found binders sealed in plastic, sorted by week, each containing travel documents that didn't match the names printed on them. Dates lined up across state lines. Destinations repeated. By 10/18, the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't a single cartel piggybacking on city resources. It was a modular system, each node built to operate independently, yet optimized to connect. If one failed, others absorbed the load. Redundancy wasn't a safeguard, it was a feature. At 10:41, financial freezes hit accounts that looked harmless in isolation and lethal when viewed together. Compliance departments scrambled, phones rang unanswered, transfers queued and failed. The money stopped mid-motion, not because it was flagged as criminal, but because the approvals vanished all at once. That's when the tunnels started closing. Teams moved underground in Minneapolis to seal access points identified in the data. Some entrances were crude, others were indistinguishable from legitimate infrastructure, utility hatches, service corridors, maintenance shafts keyed to credentials that still worked, until they didn't. At 11:07, a convoy broke pattern on Interstate 94. It altered speed by seconds, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to miss a scheduled handoff. That hesitation was all it took. The stop happened where the route bent just slightly away from habit. Inside the vehicle, the cargo wasn't labeled. It didn't need to be. The paperwork said everything the system required it to say. By late morning, the find stopped being surprising and started being heavy. Tags, schedules, intake forms stamped with dates that aligned across multiple cities, lists that tracked people the way logistics firms track pallets. In some cases, there were no names at all, just weights, ages, conditions, readiness. This wasn't chaos, it was administration. At 11:53, a property adjacent to Minneapolis City Hall, listed as temporary office overflow, went dark. Power cut cleanly. Network access severed. Inside, investigators found a small operations room, stripped of personal items, designed to be abandoned quickly. The last thing left behind was a printed schedule. No signatures, no logos, just times. By noon, the scope had collapsed inward. Accounts traced back to the same intermediaries, 17 of them, each named to sound forgettable. Fleet services, consulting groups, curriculum providers, food contractors, none produced measurable output. All moved money precisely on time. From there, the flow split into layers designed to survive scrutiny, not avoid it. At 12:27, the first administrator in the approvals chain was contacted. No arrest, no cuffs, just a request to talk. The response was immediate, calm, cooperative, already prepared. The person understood the scale better than anyone in the room. They didn't ask what had been found, they asked how much. That was when investigators realized the most dangerous part of the system wasn't underground. It was how comfortable everyone involved had been operating in plain sight. confident that the structure would absorb whatever pressure came next. And for years, it had. By early afternoon, the movement slowed, not because the operation had lost momentum, but because there was less left to move. Routes went quiet, schedules stopped updating. Dashboards that had refreshed every 60 seconds for years now froze on old timestamps. The system hadn't collapsed in panic. It had simply run out of permissions. Inside the command center, the map changed character. Red markers faded to gray. Lines that once pulsed with activity thinned, then vanished. What remained wasn't a victory screen. It was absence. The outline of something that had been there for a long time and was suddenly gone. At 14:06, the mayor was formally notified. There was no spectacle, no press, no cuffs. The meeting took place in a secured municipal office that still smelled faintly of copier toner and stale coffee. He listened without interruption. No visible shock, no denial. When the tunnels were mentioned, he didn't ask where they were. He asked how many had been sealed. That answer took longer than anyone liked. What the investigators understood now was that the mayor hadn't needed to manage the network day to day. He hadn't needed to direct routes or approve shipments personally. His role had been quieter, structural. He had been the guarantor of legitimacy, the signature that kept exceptions alive, the voice that framed delays as prudence and oversight as flexibility. The system didn't require corruption in the classic sense. It required permission to continue, and it had been granted, repeatedly, cleanly, on time. By the third morning, Minneapolis woke up to a city that looked unchanged and felt wrong. Buildings still stood, streets still cleared, offices still bore their names, but operations that had run invisibly beneath the surface were gone. Municipal garages sat idle, redevelopment sites paused without explanation. Phone numbers that had always been answered rang into silence. Emergency hearings stacked up before transcripts from the raids were even finished. Regulators struggled to explain how underground corridors, mirrored ledgers, and synchronized calendars had existed for years without triggering alarms. Official language leaned on phrases like oversight gaps and process failures. Internally, the conclusion was harsher. This hadn't been a blind spot. It had been engineered trust. Inside temporary care facilities established across the region, survivors began the slow work of reorientation. Many had been moved so often they no longer knew which state they had been taken from. Names had been replaced with identifiers, days reduced to schedules. Doctors documented patterns that matched what analysts had seen in the data: nutrition cycles, sedation intervals, transport readiness. Even recovery had to undo logistics. Financial teams stopped using projections. The numbers no longer fit on briefing slides. Public funds rerouted through vendors that never delivered. Contracts renewed automatically because no one wanted responsibility for questioning programs with flawless reputations. The money had traveled clean paths because it started clean. That was the breakthrough, not laundering criminal cash, but converting civic legitimacy into fuel. Within days, a quiet directive reshaped federal priorities. A new unit formed, not focused on drugs or trafficking alone, but on camouflage. Schools, workforce programs, clinics, nonprofits, institutions built on trust rather than scrutiny. The lesson was unavoidable. The most effective cover isn't secrecy, it's credibility. The mayor never addressed the public. Neither did most of the administrators pulled into questioning. Their silence wasn't defiance, it was habit. They had spent careers operating inside rules, not outside them. In their minds, they hadn't broken the system. They had used it efficiently. One question, however, kept resurfacing in closed briefings. Why now? There had been no tip, no sloppy transaction, no panicked withdrawal. What exposed the network wasn't greed or violence, it was growth. Expansion plans required one approval too many, one replication too far, one pattern repeated often enough to be visible. The system had scaled past the point where it could remain invisible. Weeks later, analysts were still pulling threads. And deep beneath route maps and financial dashboards were notes that didn't resolve. Design comments written in a voice that didn't match anyone in custody. Observations about how trust is created, how reputations shield activity, how oversight can be redirected without resistance. The architect was never named, only inferred. Someone who understood not just crime, but institutions. Someone who didn't need to move money or people. Someone who designed environments where others did it automatically. The raid on the mayor's city was over. The tunnels were sealed. The $420 million pipeline was cut. But the final assessment, buried deep in an internal report, was colder than any headline. This wasn't a cartel problem. It wasn't a political problem. It was an architectural one. Because when a system can be weaponized simply by following its own rules, the real danger isn't the people who exploit it. It's how long everyone else assumes it never could be.